In 1619, a young Patuxet man named Tisquantum returned to his Massachusetts Bay village. But no mother or father or wife hurried to welcome him home. His village was deserted, the houses overgrown, and in the place of family and friends lay a field of bones. Five years earlier, Tisquantum had been captured by Englishmen and taken to Spain to be sold into slavery. Freed by Spanish priests, he made his way to England. From there, he worked his way back to North America as a guide and interpreter on an English ship. Tisquantum's village had been decimated by disease brought by the same English slavers who had abducted him. Now he stood in the shattered remnants of his home. This year there would be no ceremony of thanksgiving for the bounties of the earth and sea. No thanks for the corn, the wild turkeys and geese, the lobsters, walnuts, and berries that were so plentiful. Tisquantum's long journey finally ended in Montauk, capital of the neighboring Wampanoag Nation, themselves recovering from the ravages of European diseases. In December of the following year, 1620, a small English ship, the Mayflower, sailed into the Patuxet Bay, landing at the site of Tisquantum's deserted village. The English renamed it Plymouth. The Pilgrims' first winter was a hard one. Sickness and starvation reduced the 100 colonists by half. No Indian people came forward, and none could be found. With the coming of spring, the surviving Pilgrims were amazed by the appearance of one Indian man who greeted them with the word, "Welcome." His name was Samoset.
He had learned some broken English among the Englishmen that came to fish at Monhegan. We questioned him of many things. He told us the place where we now live is called Patuxet, and that about 4 years ago, all the inhabitants died of an extraordinary plague, and there is neither man, woman, nor child remaining, as indeed we have found none, so that there is none to hinder our possession or lay claim unto it. William Bradford, Plymouth Colony.
Samoset left Plymouth and traveled to Montauk to bring word of the fledgling colony to the Wampanoag leader, Massasoit. Within days, Massasoit and an entourage set out on the trip to Plymouth. Samoset was sent ahead with someone whose English was even better than his own. Tisquantum, the last Patuxet, the one person who could truly call Plymouth home. Later that day, Massasoit arrived.
He was a very robust man in his best years, grave of countenance and spare of speech. His face was painted with a red, like mulberry, and he was oiled both head and face. William Bradford, Plymouth Colony.
Using Samoset and Tisquantum as interpreters, Massasoit negotiated a treaty with the Pilgrims for peace and mutual protection. Massasoit had reason to seek allies. The European epidemics had wiped out a vast majority of the Wampanoag people and neighboring nations. However, their powerful rivals to the west, the Narragansett, were left untouched. An alliance with the Pilgrims would help the Wampanoag regain their diplomatic strength.
Why would they want to have two enemies? The Narragansetts, whom they could probably consider to be their biggest threat, or these gnat-like English people that kept coming around the country, but they never seemed to stay before. Now all of a sudden they got a group of them that's building houses that have brought their families, women, first time English women have been in New England. Native logic would say, well, you don't bring your women where you're going to make war. So let's make peace with these people, use them as allies. They got their strange weapons, and if we make peace with them first, before anybody else does, then we'll have them on our side and we won't have to face their guns.
While Massasoit and his entourage returned to Montauk, Tisquantum remained with the Pilgrims on his beloved homeland and taught the new arrivals how to plant and where to fish. In the fall, 20 acres of Indian corn stood at Plymouth ready for harvest. And just as Tisquantum taught the Pilgrims to plant, he must have told them of the annual ceremony of Thanksgiving. A ceremony of thanks to celebrate the gifts of their world. The Pilgrims embraced the event and invited Massasoit and his Wampanoag to share their bounty. The Indian leader arrived with 90 of his people and 5 deer for the feast. For 3 days and nights, the celebration continued. Prayers and dances, alternating with shooting contests, wrestling matches, and games. The Thanksgiving of 1621 would be remembered as the Pilgrims' first. But for the Wampanoag, such a day of thanks had occurred from the beginning of time.
We believe that everything that was given to us was a gift from the Creator. So because it was a gift, we remembered to give thanks. And we did that in all of the ways that we could. And this was the basis of our ceremonial life. And because everything was a gift, we realized there was an obligation that comes with a gift, and that obligation was to share. Because if we didn't share, there was no reason for the Creator to continue to give us those gifts.
At the end of the first Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims and Wampanoag promised to make the feast an annual celebration of their harvests and friendship. But the relationship between the nations was destined to change.
We gave them unconditional acceptance and love and nurturement. That was, otherwise they would have been massacred at the beach.
When the English first came, my father was a great man, and the English, a little child. He constrained other Indians from harming the English. He gave the English corn and showed them how to plant. He let them have 100 times more land than now I have for my own people. King Philip, Wampanoag.
For almost 40 years, while the Plymouth colony rapidly expanded, Massasoit maintained peace between his Wampanoag and the English.
The Massasoit of the Wampanoag Nation, he was a magnificent peacekeeper. And that 50 years of peace maintained between us and the English was really due to his intelligence, integrity, and love for the people.
By the time of Massasoit's death in 1660, a new generation had risen to power in Plymouth. they had long forgotten his generosity. Leadership passed to Massasoit's 24-year-old son, Philip. He would become known as King Philip.
But then when Philip took over, he was a different sort of a person. He was going to fight to the end for his people.
In 1662, when King Philip came to power, the growing colonies held 50,000 residents. In New England, Indian nations found themselves surrounded. Their agricultural lands shrinking, many Wampanoag were left with little choice but to work for the English as laborers and servants. But it wasn't just land and liberty they were losing. Their culture and traditions were also under attack.
The English, they thought of Wampanoags as inferior from all the way around, from a standpoint, especially the religion. And then as a people, they were savages.
Zealous Puritans set out to convert them, pressuring many to abandon their homes and beliefs and to move to newly established praying towns. With little regard for the laws of the sovereign Wampanoag nation, the English arrested King Philip's people for violating the Puritan code of ethics, the Blue Laws. Individuals were prosecuted for hunting and fishing on the Sabbath, for using Indian medicine, and entering into non-Christian marital unions.
The women, when we went out for our moon lodge and spent time alone or with our friends who also had their moon at the same time, and we sit out there in the woods alone chatting and purifying, they made laws against us that we couldn't do that, that we needed to be in the village, we needed to be working, except for on the Sabbath.
In Plymouth, Indian people were sentenced to death for denying the Christian religion.
Pray or be shot was the method of conversion. That's how the first Christian Indians had Christianity brought to them.
King Philip took an uncompromising stand against the repression.
You see this vast country before us, which the Creator gave to our fathers. You see these little ones, our wives and children. And you now see the foe before you. They have grown insolent and bold. All our ancient customs are disregarded. Treaties made by our fathers are broken. Our brothers murdered before our eyes. King Philip, Wampanoag.
15 years after his father's death, King Philip finally urged his people to war.
Our ancestors' spirits cry to us for revenge. These people from the unknown world will cut down our groves, spoil our hunting and planting grounds, and drive us and our children from the graves of our fathers.
King Philip had no other choice because his land was being taken away. His people, the allegiance of his people, was being eroded. The war itself was not only over land, it was also over the right to follow our own traditions the Creator had given us.
On June 24th, 1675, King Philip's War began. In a brilliantly orchestrated series of forays, several English towns were caught off guard and burned to the ground by the Wampanoag and their allies.
An Indian never forgets a kindness, but he never forgives a wrong. And because there had been so much kindness shown during those good years between Massasoit, King Philip's father, and those settlers that came, King Philip never forgot any of those families had been close to he and his family. And he spared them. He actually even sent warnings to some of those families during the war that their towns would be burned so they could escape with their families.
As Indian victories mounted, hysteria gripped the settlements. It was reported that Indian troops hung upon the fringes of the English towns like the lightning on the edge of clouds. On the side of a bridge over the Charles River, one of King Philip's men posted a taunting message.
Know by this paper that the Indians that you have provoked to wrath and anger will war, if you will. There are many Indians yet. You must consider the Indians lose nothing but their life. You must lose your fair houses and cattle. James, Nipmuc.
Through the fall and winter, fortune favored King Philip's forces. Then, a series of defeats demoralized some Wampanoag allies.
The Great Swamp Massacre was where over 300 Native American old women and children were all burnt alive in their wigwams just 6 days before Christmas, December 19th, 1675. And one historian recorded that the smell of burning flesh so moved one of the Pilgrim soldiers that he later asked one of his superiors whether burning their enemies alive was consistent with the benevolent principles of the gospel.
The fortunes of war were turning. With the coming of spring, their winter food stores were depleted and they were unable to plant or replenish their supplies. King Philip's people were starving, and English troops hunted them as though trailing a wounded animal. In May, the English attacked an allied Indian force camped above the falls on the Connecticut River. 300 Indian people were killed. Some managed to reach their canoes, but in their haste, left behind their paddles and were swept over the falls to their deaths. For the next 2 months, King Philip and his people evaded capture, but the noose was tightening. In August, English troops fell upon his camp, killing or capturing 173. King Philip narrowly escaped, but among those captured were his wife and 9-year-old son. In Plymouth, the clergy decided their fate. They were sold into slavery in Bermuda.
My heart breaks. Now, I am ready to die.
He would choose where he would die. King Philip returned to his home at Montauk, where his father, Massasoit, had often fed and entertained the Pilgrims decades earlier. In the dawn light of August 12th, 1676, an English and Indian army surrounded the sleeping camp. Moments later, King Philip was dead, shot through the heart by an Indian mercenary. King Philip's head was put on display in Plymouth, where it remained for the next 20 years.
We all have a purpose, a role in life, and the Creator, in all of his wisdom, saw fit to spare us. We all could have been burned alive in the Great Swamp. We all could have been slaughtered in that war. But we were left here for a reason, and I believe that part of that reason is to be a conscience for this society, to prevent those same kinds of mistakes from continuing to be repeated over and over. That's what I see as my purpose, as the purpose of all of our Native people who will stand up and continue with that spirit that King Philip, Pontiac, Geronimo, all of our great leaders have had.